Welcome to Mac Talk, a Middle Tennessee podcast from Monthaven Arts and Cultural Center in Hendersonville, Tennessee. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at Centerpoint Wines and Liquors in Hendersonville. I'm your announcer, Jim Black. We've got a terrific Johnny Cash exhibit coming to Monthaven. It's called 1968, A Folsom Redemption. It'll be on display at the MAC through May 25th. This amazing show features 31 original photographs, all documenting Johnny Cash's legendary 1968 performance at California's Folsom State Prison. One of the journalists who traveled with Johnny Cash to that 1968 is here with us today. His name is Gene Beley. He'll be speaking with the MAC's Chief Operating Officer, John Pitcher, about this legendary concert. John, take it away.
Thank you, Jim. And Gene, welcome to Mac Talk. In 1968, you were a 28-year-old reporter and freelancer working in Ventura, California. And my first question, you were just fresh out of graduate school, I think, relatively, master's degree from UCLA.
1967.
So I guess my first question is, how did you land a gig like this? I mean, this is the kind of thing I'd expect maybe the great LA Times music critic Robert Hilborn to be doing, but a new freelancer and reporter, that's pretty amazing. How did you get this gig?
Well, that's an interesting side story. I was sitting at home one night, and the chief photographer on our newspaper at the Ventura Star Free Press called me and said, "Gene, we've been invited to go to Folsom Prison with Johnny Cash." And I said, "Well, who invited us?" And he says, "Well, I was at this New Year's Eve party, and I met one of his best friends, the Reverend Floyd Gresset." Well, Cash was so on the skids back then, it was kind of incongruous that one of his best friends was a minister.
Okay.
So I asked Dan, I said, "Well, can I meet the minister before we go?" He says, "No problem." So anyhow, he introduced me to the Reverend Floyd Gresset, and he said that John and June were coming to town before the concert and to meet him out at his parents' home in Oakview. So that's how I met John Cash, and when I first got there, he wasn't there. And then I saw June and him walking down this country road to his parents' trailer park, and it was like two movie stars stepping off of a big screen in your theater. I mean, you got to realize that I grew up in the 50s in high school when his first hit songs hit. So I was kind of starstruck, of course. Mm-hmm. And when they arrived, I thought, now what's my strategy for taking photos for a family newspaper? Mm-hmm. And I had the problem where June was kind of the other woman.
Right.
Even though the divorce had gone through about 2 years previous to that with Vivian Cash. So I decided to depict him as a family man by having him swing his nephew out in the backyard of his parents' place. And then the second photo that was the winner was him arm wrestling his nephew at the kitchen table with 6-year-old Timmy Hancock. Mm-hmm. I can go on from there if you have any more questions.
Well, I'm wondering, I guess, were you sort of warming him up to you and sort of building some confidence?
Well, I didn't consciously think that way, but in hindsight, I was a lucky guy that because I started at his parents' home, I think that's what gave me an inroad to a long-term relationship with John.
Right.
That made me stand above the other reporters that later, because after he started the network show is when we kind of lost contact. And he said he was so busy. He says, "You won't believe how busy I am." And about 25 years after the last interview I did with him on March 1st, 1969 in Anaheim, I wanted to, my young son, high school age, teenage son, was really into music, and I wanted to introduce him to John. And in fact, my son's name is Sean. So I was going to introduce Sean to John. And it had been 25 years, and I wasn't even sure John would remember me. I mean, he'd met millions of people by then. But when I did go there, and his manager at first said, "Oh, there's no way I can get you together with him tonight. We got to leave right after the show." I said, "Well, give him my card, and we're going to go eat and then see the show." His road manager came running back to find me. I said, "Gene, John wants to see you." And anyhow, I can bore you with stories all day long. That's
actually a great story. I want to follow up with something you alluded to. You said that when you first met Johnny Cash, he was a little bit on the skids. Now, in 1968, we all today think of Johnny Cash as this legendary figure. As the writer Shelby Foote would say, well, he's been marbleized. He is a larger-than-life figure. But that was not always the case, was it? In 1968, he was maybe a little bit more of a questionable character. And as I understand, your newspaper didn't even really write all that many great positive stories about him.
Actually, the managing editor of the newspaper hated Johnny Cash.
Really?
And he had been the one who had been writing nothing but negative stories about John for quite a few years. And I mean, he even wrote how John raced through town in his Cadillac. I mean, it could be as little as that.
There was something about a Christmas speaker or something, right? That he
put a
speaker on his house.
That's my favorite story.
Yeah, tell me that one.
He put big speakers atop his roof in his 5,000 square foot house in Casita Springs, which was just a little ways out of Ventura, in between Ventura and Ojai, California. And blared Christmas music. And, of course, some of the people in the valley loved it, but others complained. So the sheriff came out and pulled the plug. And so the headline was something like Johnny Cash music, plug pulled, Cash has a blue Christmas.
Blue Christmas, sort of a little bit of an Elvis tribute there, too. Well, and I guess hence the name of your show, the exhibit here, a redemption, a Folsom Redemption. So part of what's going on here is a remake of this great musician's career. And of course, you were mentioning the TV show. That was about 1969 when that started, wasn't it?
Right.
Okay. Well, it's interesting. Tell me what Johnny Cash was like. I mean, you knew him in person. How would you describe him?
Exactly opposite of what his image was. And the best example I can give is when we were walking into Folsom Prison. I mean, I tell people now it helps to be stupid, because I was taking this big old Sony reel-to-reel recorder in, and if you're smart, you would have thought, well, there's no way I can take that in because Columbia executives won't let me take that in.
Right, because they were going to record a record.
Yeah, and the prison probably has rules against it. But I was too stupid to think of it that way. And so I was walking in, a Columbia executive did say, "You can't take that in there." And John spoke up and says, "Yes, he can. He's my friend, and he's a reporter from Ventura."
Right.
To me, that speaks volumes for his character. And he was just real friendly and down to earth, and you never think of him as a big star or anything. He was just real down to earth and treated me royally.
Well, let me follow that with the question. At that time, I think he would have been about 36 years old, and you were about 28 years old. So you weren't too terribly far apart in age. Why do you think he befriended you like that? Well, I mean, I could think of a lot of big stars maybe being a little bit shy of reporters.
It's a good question.
He liked you. You were the Ventura guy.
I think because our newspaper was in the area where his 4 daughters still lived.
Okay.
And nothing but negative stories had been written, and I was the first one to have any positive story. So I'm sure that had a huge influence.
Well, maybe it probably helped him trust you.
True.
Well, he was with June, the other woman, as you said. I think one of the my favorite quotes that I have seen coming out of this story was from her when she gets out and sees a beautiful sunny day. I think she refers to it as a huckleberry picking day.
Yes, that was...
I love that quote so much. And it just sounds like June Carter Cash. Tell me about her.
Well, I think one of my big regrets in life is that we didn't take more pictures of June. You know, we took one great photo of, it might have been on their first anniversary of them hugging each other. And I think that's in our exhibit here in Hendersonville. I can remember when the Folsom Prison concert ended, and she and I were standing there, and she said, "Do you know why the prisoners like John? It's because they identify with him because he looks as mean as any of them."
That is great. Well, why did Cash want to go to record in a prison? Did he talk about that at all? I know that he was aware of Folsom Prison. He'd been aware of it since, he was a younger man. I think he was stationed in the Air Force or something at one time and knew about the prison.
One thing that most people don't know is that was his second appearance at Folsom Prison.
Okay.
One before wasn't anywhere near as successful. And I think it even rained that day, and it was outside in a rodeo ring or something.
Okay.
And the Reverend Floyd Gressett's hobby was ministering to the prisoners in California. And there was a prison DJ, that broadcasted in the prison. And I think his name was Floyd Green. And Green asked the Reverend Floyd Gressett any chance of getting Cash back here again. So between Reverend Gressett and the prison coach, Lloyd Kelly, those two had a huge influence that led to that concert. And they don't get much publicity on their role in that, so that's why I always like to talk about them.
Okay. Well, take me back to that day. That it's January 13th, 1968. You roll up to this giant fortress. It's sort of an infamous place too. What was your impression when you drove up to this?
Well, let's back up a little
famous
bit,
place. Sure,
and go down the hill from Folsom Prison.
Okay.
When the prison officials met us because we had left Columbia. Well, Columbia Records hired the limousines that took us from the hotel in West Sacramento to the prison. And we got to the bottom of the prison. It's Prison Road, actually. We were asked to transfer into this drab gray prison bus.
Okay.
And so
that's everybody, right?
Yeah. And so we're going up the hill. I'll never forget how Harold Reed was such a, the Statlers. He was such a comedian. If he wasn't a singer, he could have been a famous comedian.
Right.
So when he was cracking jokes, it was just, I was just like a mouse in the corner enjoying the show, the insider show.
Right.
And so when we got to the prison, then everybody got out of that bus, and then when we went into prison, I already told you part of the story about me carrying in the big Sony reel-to-reel tape recorder, the dunce I am. But when that door clanged shut behind me, I realized then how many men went through that, never to get to see the outside again, and maybe even were executed in there. And then when the show was held in the prison cafeteria, and the stage that they made was right in front of where they used to hang people. So if you don't know that, to me it gave new meaning to the song of what's the title of it?
25 minutes to go?
Yeah.
What a great song. Well, the entire album, of course, is remarkable, and I would imagine that at least part of Johnny Cash's motivation is that he has this material that was just perfect. What I find most striking when I listen to his performance, which is a live performance, and of course he's joking in parts of it, but it's how much the audience connects with him, even to some of the gallows humor. in some of these songs.
Right.
What was your feeling about being in that audience? Because you were there, you were in the front row, or pretty
Right.
close, right?
Right.
With all of these guys.
You know, when I was first there, I was very nervous because I was sitting with the prisoners.
Right.
And I didn't know that each prisoner had earned the right to go there on good behavior. Mm-hmm. But when I was sitting there nervous, I was slightly relieved when I looked up at the catwalk and saw the guards with the long rifles.
Right.
And I guess the highlight of my day there was when John announced he was going to sing Glenn Shirley's song, Greystone Chapel.
Well, tell us about that song, and tell us about Glenn Shirley. And maybe back up and about how Johnny found out about this song and wrote it out. And because it seems remarkable to me that, because that's a great song. And it was remarkable to me that, you know, he wrote it out and was able to perform it on a Johnny Cash level just almost overnight.
Well, Glenn Shirley was in there for armed robbery, and he obviously smuggled the tape out to, I don't know, his sister or some relative who gave it to the Reverend Floyd Gressett. And, you know, when we were, the night before, when we were sitting around the motel room, John was pretty nervous about the band getting here because he'd heard there was bad weather in Nashville. Mm-hmm. But he discovered that they were stuck in San Francisco.
Right.
So while we were waiting for them to get there that evening, that's when Reverend Gressett asked if John would listen to this demo tape. And he, you know, saying, I promised this lady you'd listen to it. And if you would just, you know, tell the audience tomorrow that you did listen to it, the author of this song would really be happy.
Right.
So he said, anybody got a tape recorder? And I raised my hand, and he says, well, go get it. And so when I brought it, and we put that tape on there, I mean, the impression was just outstanding that this guy was really good. And I blurted out, said, John, if they let this guy out of prison, he'll put you out of business.
What did Johnny Cash think of that?
I think John got used to my audacious statements. I can tell you another story later.
Okay, please do.
He repeated it in Madison Square Garden concert.
Right. This guy just says these audacious things about me.
Yeah, to focus on this Greystone Chapel song, he says, bring the tape recorder to my room. I want to write down the lyrics. I'm going to record that tomorrow.
Wow. So
we took the recorder to his room, and that's when we got that great photo of him writing down the lyrics. Mm-hmm. And it's
which we can see in the exhibit at Monthaven. Right. It's a great photo.
And so from there, the rest is history of that song. But it's a Greek tragedy because, you know, John got the writer of the song and singer of the song on that demo tape. He got him out of prison by having Governor Reagan okay it, and they transferred him to a Tennessee prison. Mm-hmm. I forget the exact prison here, but you could probably find that out quickly in Google. So from there, I saw him perform. Well, John, of course, hired him, mm-hmm. and I saw him perform in Anaheim on March 1st, 1969, and I realized that he wasn't good as a performer on stage with all the other professional musicians, right. That he hadn't had all experience of all these other professional musicians. In fact, that night, Marty Robbins was one of the guest stars on stage. So you can imagine that's a lot of talent on stage.
Well, the fact that these guys, you know, including Johnny Cash, I mean, they're the kind of band that can take a song like this and give a performance the very next day that's record worthy. You know, they can. That's a Nashville band. You know, they're the best in the world.
So, the highlight of this Greek tragedy was when Glenn Shirley threatened some of the band members, and John fired him. Yeah. And to fast forward, Glenn Shirley ended up committing suicide in his trailer in California, just south of I think it was Gonzales, California, just south of Salinas.
It was a sad story. He's about, what, 42 years old or something?
I can't remember exactly how old he was, but that's probably about right.
Okay. Well, 1968 was itself a very dramatic and tragic year. You know, you have the assassination of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. I think that was the year of the Tet Offensive. It was the year of the crazy Democratic National Convention. And I'm wondering, how did that music and how did that concert, how was it received back in '68? Because, I mean, it was a pretty bold recording for its time.
Well, let me tell you first that I was so excited. You know, I of course wrote the story for our Ventura newspaper, and part of my presentation and my speeches is I tell how the managing editor didn't want us to publish that. You know, the positive story.
Right. And that's at the Ventura paper, right?
Yeah, and it was one of the other editors that went ahead and published it, and later wrote me a letter verifying that his boss was against it. And it became proof also that we're freelancing, that the Ventura Star Free Press did not pay us on that trip.
Okay.
And so that we owned all the rights.
Which kind of worked out in the end, right?
Yes.
In a big way.
Yeah. And from there, excuse me, I lost my...
Well, I was just wondering how that, you know, because I think there's a line in Folsom Prison Blues that he shot someone just to watch him die. You know, and that was a violent year.
Oh,
so I was just wondering how that album would be received.
Well, first I want to go back and tell you that I thought I could sell this story to all the national magazines that existed back then. Mm-hmm. And no one would buy it. They weren't interested because of Johnny Cash's reputation at that time.
That is,
you know,
that's mind blowing to think about that today.
Well, one of his nicknames was No Show Cash, and his manager had to pay out his when he wouldn't show up. You know, Saul Holliff was his Canadian manager that handled everything for him, and from there. I finally sold it for $50 to a Tennessee Sunday Magazine section. I can't even remember which newspaper that was, but I wish I knew the name of that editor today to give him his due honor.
I think I've seen clips of that. So one magazine took a chance on that.
Yes, I couldn't sell it.
That is remarkable.
But all those magazines that I wrote and tried to sell a story to, the night that John died, they all called me and wanted photos.
Right, of course. Yeah. Well, let me. You've took some photos the night when you were at Cash's parents' house, right? And your editor Dan Pausch. Dan Pausch. He took many of the other photos in the.
Right. He took all the photos at Folsom Prison, and he took. He didn't go with me on some of the other concerts like Riverside and San Bernardino, where like one at Riverside, I got a favorite picture there when John was signing autographs. Right. And he leaned over and said, "Gene, would you take the girls to the bus?" Because his two daughters that were very young then were with him. And I can tell you another story on that if you'd like. He got done signing autographs, when we were going to Denny's to have hamburgers.
Okay.
You want me to do that?
Yeah,
now?
Tell me. Let's hear it.
Okay. When we got to Denny's, I said, "John, you had such a great show tonight. You're going to get mobbed in there." And he says, "Yeah." He says, and he gave me a bunch of cash bills and said, "Here, you go in and buy the hamburgers." And later I regret that so much, because think of the historic photos I could have gotten with Johnny Cash, Carl Perkins, and the Statler brothers, all of them in Denny's.
That would have been great. Well, actually, I should ask you about that. Tell me a little bit about the entourage, because you had, Carl Perkins and the Statler brothers. Tell me a little bit about them and about their appearance.
Well, they were all great, of course, and one of my other great... I always like to tell my failures rather than successes to audiences, and one of my great failures was not taking more pictures of Carl Perkins and Luther Perkins, who died just months after the Folsom Prison concert. And, I had one interaction with Carl Perkins where he says, Gene, you're a writer. Here's a poem I wrote, and it was on Holiday Inn stationery, which I still have today. And I should have had more interaction with them and the Statler brothers. Like I say, I was such a great fan of Statler brothers, and Harold Reed is a comedian of the group. And so I can't really elaborate on your question because I didn't have that much interaction with the rest of them.
Sure. It was we think we were so focused on Johnny Cash being there, but it was a really big variety show almost.
Yes.
So really amazing. What are some of your favorite photos in this exhibit at Monthaven?
Well, I think the one of John arm wrestling with his 6-year-old nephew, Timmy Hancock, who was his sister Reba Hancock's son. And Reba was his business manager at that time. And she lived, when I first met them, Reba lived in Ojai, a short distance from his parents' home in Oakville.
So that definitely gives a different image of Johnny Cash than what a lot of people would have expected to see at that time, sort of the family man.
And I think the photo, of course, I'm in one of those photos, like we said before, of sitting in the audience with the prisoners.
Right.
Him on stage, solo on stage, is certainly one of our outstanding photos.
Right, that's a very famous photo of him on that stool. And I think we see you in front, and I think his father, Ray Cash,
was sitting next to me.
And you guys had to dress differently because you couldn't look like the prisoners, right?
Exactly. They told us not to wear Levi's or certain shirts, and you can tell most of the prisoners have, a lot of them have hats on. And I think another thing, when I first looked around, I was kind of in shock that so many of them looked like the boy next door. I mean, they were the Hell's Angel types, of course, but it was very educational. The first time I'd ever been in any state prison, and to see that a lot of them looked just like the boy next door is scary.
Yeah, it is scary. Well, maybe just one more question. I appreciate your visiting with us today, but I'm wondering, what do you hope visitors who come to the exhibit, what do you hope they take away? What do you want them to see?
Well, it's a time capsule, and I hope they can enjoy each photo and take part of the history with them.
Okay. And it's definitely a behind-the-scenes look at Johnny Cash. You get a sense of him as a human being very much. They're very warm and personal photos. Well, Gene, thank you. His exhibit, 1968, A Folsom Redemption, is on display at Monthaven Arts and Cultural Center through May 25th. We'd like to thank Sumner County Tourism, Mid-America Arts Alliance, and the National Endowment for the Arts for helping make it all possible. Gene, thank you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Mac Talk, a Middle Tennessee podcast from Monthaven Arts and Cultural Center in Hendersonville. Today's episode was brought to you by Centerpoint Wines and Liquors. Our guest today was journalist Gene Beley. An exhibit of original photographs documenting Johnny Cash's Folsom concert is on display at the MAC through May 25th. For more information about this show, visit our website at monthavenarts.org. Our podcast music was written by Nashville composer Christina Spinay. Our producer is Jonah Pitcher. I'm your announcer, Jim Black, and we'll see you next time.